12,800 years ago, the world changed. Not slowly, not over centuries. Fast. Within a single human lifetime, the direction of an entire planet reversed. You could have been born into a warming world, glaciers retreating, seas rising, landscapes greening, everything trending toward the temperate and the livable. And then, before you died, everything changed. The temperature dropped, the growing seasons shortened, the animals you hunted disappeared, the land your community had settled flooded. Within a generation, the world your parents described to you was gone. We know this happened. The evidence is in ice cores drilled from Greenland, in lake sediments, in the teeth of animals that died in that period, in the pollen record of plants that stopped blooming when the climate failed. What we don't know, what has become one of the most contested questions in contemporary science, is why. Why did a warming world suddenly reverse? Was it natural? Was it catastrophic? Was it connected to the stories human beings have been telling each other for 12,000 years? About fire from the sky and a world destroyed by flood? Tonight we're going inside that question. And whatever you think you know about what happened 12,800 years ago, the truth is stranger. The world before. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what existed. The planet was not the same shape. Sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today. The shallow continental shelves surrounding the world's landmasses were exposed dry land, vast territories that are now permanently submerged. The North Sea between Britain and Denmark was a plain of hills, rivers, and forests. Britain was not an island. It was a peninsula, connected to continental Europe across what is now open water. Southeast Asia was unrecognizable. Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and dozens of smaller islands were elevated peaks of a single enormous landmass, Sundaland, connected to the Asian continent. Larger than Western Europe, all of it warm, tropical, habitable. The world had different geography, and it had different life. The woolly mammoth was not a rarity. It ranged across the northern hemisphere in numbers that rivaled the great herds of the modern African savanna. The woolly rhinoceros shared those cold landscapes. The cave bear, larger than any modern bear, ranged across Europe and Asia. In North America, the mastodon, the short-faced bear, the American lion, the saber-toothed cat. Not mythological creatures, real animals living in real ecosystems alongside real human beings. Because humans were there, not in cities, but anatomically modern, cognitively identical to us in every measurable way. Sophisticated hunters, skilled toolmakers, people who had been accumulating knowledge for hundreds of thousands of years. The cave paintings of Chauvet in France, depicting lions and horses with a confidence that humbles modern artists, were 35,000 years old at the time of the catastrophe we're about to describe. These were not primitive people. They were different, adapted to a world that was about to end. The climate broke. The evidence comes from ice. Columns of ice drilled from the Greenland ice sheet, each layer preserving a chemical record of the atmosphere at the time it fell as snow. Reading them is like reading a diary, a very old, very detailed diary, written by the climate itself. The Greenland record shows the warming trend of the late Ice Age. Steady, gradual, the kind of change you'd measure over millennia. And then, at a specific layer corresponding to approximately 12,800 years ago, the record changes. Not gradually. The climate broke. Within what appears to be as few as 50 years, some evidence points to even faster. Temperatures in the North Atlantic dropped by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. That is not a small fluctuation. That is an ice age arriving on fast forward. For comparison, the difference between today's climate and the peak of the last ice age, with its kilometer-thick ice sheets over North America and Europe, was 5 to 6 degrees of global average temperature. The Younger Dryas cooling was twice that. Applied regionally, applied in decades. This period has a name, the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic wildflower that reappeared across Europe when the cold returned. The flower had been retreating northward as the climate warmed. When temperatures crashed, it came back. A flower came back. And everything else went wrong. For approximately 1,200 years, the world was thrown backward. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it ended. Temperatures rose again. The survivors emerged into a transformed world. The question that took decades to properly formulate. What was the trigger? What caused a warming world to suddenly, violently reverse? The lake that changed everything. And its problem. For most of the 20th century, the answer seemed clear. A massive glacial lake called Loch Agassiz had been accumulating behind ice dams in what is now central Canada as the North American ice sheets melted. Larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. An inland sea of meltwater dammed by ice. When the dam failed, the lake drained catastrophically. An almost incomprehensible volume of cold fresh water poured into the North Atlantic. That fresh water disrupted the ocean circulation that brings warm tropical water northward. The warm water stopped arriving. The northern hemisphere cooled. A mega flood. Natural. Dramatic. Well within the range of events the geological record had seen before. For decades, this was considered the answer. But there were problems. The timing wasn't quite right. The evidence for the Lake Agassiz drainage didn't perfectly align with the onset of the Younger Dryas. And the sheer speed of the cooling, measurable in years, not centuries, was difficult to account for through circulation disruption alone. Then, in 2007, a team of 26 researchers across multiple disciplines published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Its central claim was simple. The Younger Dryas was not triggered by a flood. It was triggered by something falling from the sky. The impact hypothesis. The paper proposed that approximately 12,800 years ago, a large comet or swarm of cometary fragments entered Earth's atmosphere and produced a series of airbursts and surface impacts across the northern hemisphere simultaneously. Not one explosion. Hundreds. Over a territory spanning millions of square kilometers. Imagine shattering a massive comet into thousands of pieces and letting them rain down across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia within a very short period. The immediate effects: massive wildfires across large portions of North America, triggered by the thermal pulse of multiple airbursts. Soot and particulate matter rising into the upper atmosphere, reducing solar radiation reaching the surface. Less sunlight, lower temperatures. Simultaneously, the thermal shock of impacts onto the North American ice sheets could have destabilized them, triggering the catastrophic meltwater floods that disrupted ocean circulation. Fire. Then cold. Then flood. The researchers said they had evidence, a specific layer in the geological record, corresponding to the exact onset of the Younger Dryas, containing materials characteristic of cosmic impact events. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds that form under the extreme pressure of cosmic impacts, found in sediment corresponding to 12,800 years ago at multiple sites. Platinum anomalies. Platinum is rare on Earth's surface, but more common in extraterrestrial material. A spike in platinum concentrations at the Younger Dryas boundary found across 4 continents. Magnetic spherules, tiny iron-rich spheres formed when rock or soil is vaporized by impact and rapidly cooled in the atmosphere. A layer of black matte, dark, carbon-rich sediment, visible in soil profiles across large areas of North America. Below the black matte, abundant megafauna remains, abundant human artifacts. Above it, a dramatic reduction in both. Something happened at that layer, something that killed large animals and disrupted human populations on a continental scale. The evidence keeps growing. The scientific debate that followed was one of the most contentious in modern geology. Critics raised specific objections. Some markers couldn't be replicated at certain sites. The distribution of evidence across a huge area was unusual for any single impact. Platinum anomalies could have alternative explanations. These are serious objections. They have been taken seriously. But here is what has happened since. The evidence has continued to accumulate. By the most recent comprehensive reviews, impact markers have been confirmed at over 50 sites across North America, Europe, the Middle East, Central America, and South America. The platinum anomaly has been found across multiple continents. Most significantly, a 2018 study of Greenland ice cores found a platinum spike at exactly the layer corresponding to the Younger Dryas onset. Ice cores cannot be contaminated by the terrestrial conditions that might affect soil sediment samples. Whatever put platinum in the upper atmosphere at exactly 12,800 years ago left a record in snow that fell on a Greenland glacier, far from any terrestrial source. Something was in the atmosphere, something that carried platinum. The same year, researchers in South Africa found glassy spherules, the kind formed when rock is vaporized by impact and rapidly cooled, at archaeological sites corresponding to the same date. The impact evidence had now reached the southern hemisphere. The debate is not over, but the hypothesis has shifted from fringe proposal to serious contender. And underneath all the technical arguments, there is a simpler question. If it wasn't an impact, what was it? What produced those markers? What happened so suddenly and so completely that it left a black mat of death across a continent? And what killed the mammoths? The extinction question. The woolly mammoth had been on Earth for 4 to 5 million years. It had survived multiple ice ages, multiple climate shifts, multiple periods of dramatic environmental change. It went extinct. So did the woolly rhinoceros, the cave bear, the Irish elk, the cave lion, the horse in the Americas, the mastodon, the giant sloth, the short-faced bear, the saber-toothed cat. Approximately 2/3 of large mammal species in North America went extinct in a geologically brief period. The scale of what was lost is hard to absorb, not individual species. A systemic ecological collapse. The dominant megafauna of an entire hemisphere, gone. 2 hypotheses have dominated the debate. The first, overkill. Human hunters, encountering animals that had never seen us before, killing faster than the populations could recover. The correlation between human arrival and megafaunal extinction in various regions is real and compelling. But the correlation has limits. In Eurasia, humans and megafauna had coexisted for hundreds of thousands of years without mass extinction. In North America, the timing of the extinctions aligns better with the Younger Dryas catastrophe than with the initial human arrival. The second, climate change. The disruptions of the late Ice Age transition were severe enough to stress megafaunal populations. Large animals with slow reproductive rates are particularly vulnerable to rapid environmental change. But climate change alone doesn't account for the speed and completeness of the North American extinctions, which is where the impact hypothesis adds a third dimension: a cosmic impact event, wildfires, immediate ecological collapse. The Younger Dryas cooling would have hit populations already under pressure from both human hunting and climate change simultaneously. The combination could explain what neither hunting nor climate can explain alone. And it connects directly to what happened to the people, the Clovis disappearance. Below the black mat across North America, abundant evidence of the Clovis culture. Large, distinctive fluted stone points found at sites across the continent, associated with the hunting of megafauna. A widespread, successful human culture that had mastered the late Ice Age landscape. Above the black mat, the Clovis culture disappears, not gradually, not replaced in an obvious sequence by a successor culture. Gone. The human cultures that appear afterward are different, less widespread, less uniform. As if the population had been dramatically reduced, and the survivors, scattered and isolated, developed regional traditions in the absence of the continental-scale connection they'd had before. Whatever happened at the black mat boundary, the people who had been living in North America did not simply carry on. Their world ended, and the world that followed was something different. And here's what the genetic record adds to this. The global human genetic record shows a population bottleneck at approximately the Younger Dryas boundary, a dramatic reduction in effective population size, visible in the genetic diversity of populations worldwide. Human populations contracted sharply. Some lineages disappeared entirely. Every person alive today descends from someone who survived the Younger Dryas. The question of what those survivors lost, what their parents and grandparents had known, is one the genetic record cannot answer. For that, we need the archaeology. And the archaeology is, in the most relevant places, still underwater. The flooded world. The Younger Dryas was not a single event. It was a sequence. The rise and fall of temperatures, the advance and retreat of ice, and running through all of it, the relentless, catastrophic rise of the sea. The meltwater pulses that came at the end of the last ice age didn't raise sea levels gradually. They came in surges. Meltwater pulse 1A, around 14,000 years ago, may have raised global sea levels by as much as 20 meters in just a few centuries. 20 meters. In a flat coastal region, 20 meters of sea level rise floods the land for many kilometers inland. The estuaries, river deltas, and coastal plains, where human populations concentrated, the most productive and habitable environments on Earth, were inundated. And the record of everything that was there went underwater with them. The most vivid example is a place most people have never heard of. Doggerland. During the last ice age, the area now covered by the North Sea was land. Rolling hills, river valleys, and coastal plains, fed by rivers that are now the Rhine and the Thames, draining into an Atlantic coast that ran hundreds of kilometers west of where it does today. This was not marginal land. Estuaries and coastal marshes are among the most resource-rich environments on Earth. Fish, shellfish, waterfowl, marine mammals, and the terrestrial game of adjacent forests. Doggerland, at its maximum, was roughly the size of Great Britain. And it was precisely the kind of landscape where large human populations would concentrate. We know people were there. North Sea fishing trawlers have been pulling up their artifacts and animal bones for over a century. A barbed antler point, found in fishing nets in 1931, dated to approximately 12,000 years ago. Stone tools, mammoth bones, the antlers of giant deer. The bottom of the North Sea is an archaeological site, the largest unsurveyed archaeological site in Europe, and it is not alone. The Sundaland Shelf, the territory now covered by the shallow seas of Southeast Asia, held a landmass the size of Western Europe, warm and tropical, sitting in the tropics with extensive coastlines. Its lowlands are now under 30 to 50 meters of water. We have never systematically surveyed them. The Persian Gulf Basin was a river valley, fed by the Tigris and Euphrates before the sea flooded in. The people displaced from that valley moved north into the Fertile Crescent, where within a few thousand years, their descendants would develop the world's first known urban civilization. Those early Mesopotamian civilizations preserved flood myths of extraordinary emotional specificity. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its warned survivor, its vessel, its animals, its mountain landing, its birds released to test the waters, is not obviously the invention of people who had never seen a flood. It reads like the memory of one, not a metaphor, a testimony. Göbekli Tepe and the question it raises these dates, the Younger Dryas onset, the flooding, the extinctions, align with a discovery that when it was made, quietly destroyed one of the foundational assumptions of archaeology. Göbekli Tepe. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd in southeastern Turkey kicked a carved stone with his boot. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to look. He spent the next 22 years of his life excavating what he found. A complex of massive circular stone enclosures, T-shaped limestone pillars up to 5 meters tall, weighing up to 15 tons. Elaborately carved with animal reliefs, vultures, foxes, serpents, scorpions. Not crude work, confident, skilled, the product of an established artistic tradition. The date of the oldest layers, approximately 9,600 BCE. That is precisely when the Younger Dryas was ending. 100 years after the worst of the catastrophe lifted, someone was building this. Here's what makes it strange. The conventional model of prehistory says, organized monumental architecture requires agriculture. You need surplus food before you can dedicate a significant labor force to construction that produces nothing edible. Agriculture in this region began around 9,000 to 8,000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe predates it, by people who were, by every archaeological indicator, still hunter-gatherers. And here is the detail that changes everything. The oldest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, the deepest, most ancient layers, contain the largest, most precisely carved, most sophisticated pillars. The later layers are smaller, simpler, less refined. The tradition runs backward. That is not what an emerging civilization looks like. When you are learning something for the first time, the early work is rough and gets better. At Göbekli Tepe, The oldest work is the best work, which means the builders of the oldest enclosures were not inventing this tradition. They were inheriting it from somewhere, from something that predated even Göbekli Tepe. And then around 8000 BCE, while the site was still being used, someone deliberately buried it, filled the enclosure systematically with rubble and worked stone, covered the pillars, sealed everything, and walked away. We don't know why. We don't know where they went. But the timing, the deliberate burial happening as the memory of the catastrophe faded, suggests that whatever Göbekli Tepe was preserving, someone felt it needed to be sealed against an uncertain future. What were they preserving? And what came before it? The Atlantis connection. In 360 BCE, Plato wrote down a story he attributed to Egyptian priests who had told it to the Athenian statesman Solon around 590 BCE. The story was about Atlantis, a maritime civilization of advanced capability located beyond the Strait of Gibraltar in the Atlantic, destroyed in a single day and a single night by earthquakes and floods. The date given for the destruction, approximately 9600 BCE, the precise date of the Younger Dryas transition. Most historians consider Atlantis a philosophical fiction. Plato invented stories to make philosophical points, and Atlantis makes a perfect cautionary tale about hubris and the corruption of power. That may be correct, but here is the detail that won't go away. The Egyptian priests told Solon that Egypt alone had preserved the records, that great catastrophes had periodically destroyed civilizations, resetting them to zero, and that Egypt alone had maintained the memory of what came before. They framed this not as myth, but as history. Preserved, they said, in their own archives. And the specific date they gave for the catastrophe corresponds almost exactly to what we now know, from geology and ice cores and sediment analysis, was the most dramatic climate reversal in 12,000 years of human history. The Younger Dryas. Whether Atlantis was real or invented, Plato was recording an Egyptian priestly tradition that placed a civilization-ending catastrophe at exactly the date the geological record says something civilization-ending actually happened. And Göbekli Tepe, built 100 years after that date, by people whose oldest work is their best work, who then deliberately buried it, fits into this picture as an act of preservation, not creation. Memory. The question is, memory of what? What would prove it? Here is where the investigation gets specific. If sophisticated coastal civilizations existed before the Younger Dryas, their physical traces are almost certainly on the continental shelves that were exposed during the last ice age. The Sundaland Shelf, the Persian Gulf Basin, the North Sea, the Atlantic margins of North Africa and Iberia. These are now underwater. The technology to look has only recently become capable enough to matter. Autonomous underwater vehicles can now map the seafloor at resolutions approaching aerial photography. They can identify topographic anomalies, regular shapes, linear features that don't fit the surrounding geology. This work is beginning. In a small number of locations, targeted surveys have identified anomalies. The mainstream conclusion in most cases has been natural, but generated debate and definitively resolved are not the same thing. The surveys needed to definitively answer the question. Systematic coverage of the most relevant continental shelf areas would require resources that have not been committed to this question. not because of conspiracy. Because systematic oceanic survey is extraordinarily expensive, and academic institutions fund what they consider important. That may be changing. The combination of improving technology, genuine scientific interest raised by Göbekli Tepe, and the practical urgency of understanding ancient sea level rise as modern climate change accelerates the same process. All of these are increasing attention to these questions. A single definitively dated human structure, a carved stone, a foundation from below the Younger Dryas horizon in water that was dry land 12,000 years ago, would rewrite everything. Not find Atlantis as Plato described it, but prove that sophisticated human societies existed at that date and in those coastal regions, which is the actual question behind the myth. And it has not been answered, because we haven't looked. Not really. Not in the places that matter. Conclusion. Something happened 12,800 years ago. The evidence is in the ice, the sediment, the genetic record, and the myths of every culture on Earth. What we know. The Younger Dryas was real. The cooling was catastrophic and abrupt. 10 to 15 degrees in the North Atlantic within decades. The impact evidence is real and growing. Nanodiamonds, platinum anomalies, and melt glass found at over 50 sites across 4 continents, all pointing to the same moment. The megafaunal extinctions were real. 2/3 of North American large mammal species gone within a geologically brief period. The Clovis culture disappeared at the black mat horizon. Human populations contracted globally, visible in the genetic bottleneck preserved in modern DNA. Göbekli Tepe was built 100 years after the Younger Dryas ended, by people whose oldest work is their most sophisticated, and then deliberately buried. The coastal regions where any Ice Age civilizations would have left their most significant traces are now underwater, and we have not yet systematically looked. What we don't know. What precisely triggered the Younger Dryas? The impact hypothesis is compelling. It is not yet proven. What existed on the now submerged coastlines? The question of sophisticated coastal societies destroyed by these events remains open. How much of what we call the earliest human civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, was truly new? And how much was reconstruction from fragments of something older? These are not small uncertainties. They sit at the heart of the story we tell about ourselves, about where we came from, about whether the arc of human history is as clean and progressive as the conventional account suggests, or whether it contains a rupture, a catastrophic break, that we have been living downstream of ever since. Every person alive today descends from someone who survived what happened 12,800 years ago. The question of what those survivors lost, and whether the stories they told about fire from the sky and a world destroyed were testimony rather than metaphor, is still open, still unanswered, still asking to be understood. The day the world changed. We are still trying to understand it.